You're listening to These Days on KPBS here in San Diego. I'm Alison St. John, sitting in for Tom Fudge. Robert Bateman's wildlife paintings take you out into nature. It's almost as good as going for a walk in some remote landscape, except that in some ways it's even better because you get to see the animals that live there up close. You can see the deer standing in dappled shadows by a fence, or a black bear leaning out over a granite ledge, or maybe a cottontail rabbit half hidden in a pile of autumn leaves. Now, Bateman's paintings are not just designed to be beautiful. They remind us vividly of the world of nature out there that we're in danger of forgetting about in our urban lives. The San Diego Natural History Museum in Balboa Park has an exhibit of Robert Bateman's paintings on display through February. And we have the artist himself and the curator of the exhibition. So thank you both. Robert, thank you so much for coming in.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And David, thank you too.
It's good to be here.
So let's start, Robert, with you. Just talk a little bit about what got you started. I've seen some paintings by you which were when you were 14, amazing paintings of birds. What got you started painting wildlife?
Well, I love this thought about a verdant world. I guess it was a verdant world I grew up in. I was in the city of Toronto, so I'm a Canadian, eh? And and I just spent all of my spare time playing around in the creek and wandering through the woods, and fell totally in love with it. But I was always an artist. I was always a kid in class who did the art. I got serious when I was 12, when most kids give up doing art and nature and go on to other grown-up things, and I haven't grown up yet.
And we're all the beneficiaries of that. Now, over time, your style has really changed. I guess you've gone through various different periods of more impressionist, and now you've got a very, very realistic. I mean, it's almost like a photograph, but it's not a photograph. What has led you to change your style of representing
That's
nature?
right. Well, I did paint sort of little nature illustration kind of things until I was 18. And then a friend who was a much older, more mature person, he was 20, he was at the College of Art, he said, you can't do real art with a small brush. Now, so I was born in 1930, so I was 18 in 48. And around that time, Van Gogh and all that, those were the rage. And, I mean, he wasn't still alive, of course. But so I got a big brush and became an impressionist, and then a post-impressionist, and then I fell in love with Picasso's Cubism, and I became a Cubist, all the while painting actually in the field, doing Cubist renderings of nature. And then finally an abstract expressionist when I was in my early 30s, because that was what was going on in New York. And admired very much Franz Klein and Clifford Still and some of those guys at the great New York school. And then I saw an Andrew Wyeth show in the Albright Knox Museum in Buffalo, which was a high-tone, art snob, contemporary art museum. And here was a guy actually caring about the particularity of the planet. Whether a stone wall had a particular texture or the tree trunk had a particular texture. And it was my road to Damascus. That one night, I said, I cannot really be a naturalist and have a big fat brush and slap paint all over the place, because being a naturalist is all about particularity.
So you have a commitment really to the subject that you're painting as much as...
I really do. Yes,
right.
I do.
You've said this is not a hobby. It's not even a career in painting. So talk a bit about why it's more than that for you.
Well, I actually... When I was growing up, I'm sort of a historic figure now. When I was growing up in Canada, there were virtually no artists who made a full-time living at art. Even the famous ones were teachers part-time. So I went into high school teaching, and I always said I taught for fun and I painted for real. So I was painting away and giving away my paintings until I was 35, and then finally I started selling my paintings until I was 46, so I was a teacher, and gradually I evolved into being a full-time artist.
Full-time artist.
Yeah.
But in some ways your art is still teaching.
It is, yeah. I don't want to be overtly didactic, but I think you could say the body of my work does what I think is the key thing, the most important thing, and that is, do you feel in your heart something about nature? That's why I like that word verdant. Because if you don't, if the populace doesn't, then they're not going to vote for bills and propositions that protect nature and for budgets that protect nature. And we're in a crisis mode now. Also, we're in a crisis mode that young kids' brains have been invaded by electronics, and they're not playing outside anymore. And so I think it's very important that it's in people's hearts. However, I do paint quite a number of message pieces, and if folks come to the Natural History Museum, they'll see, I think it may be my most important painting. It's a scene in a drift net with a dead Pacific white-sided dolphin and Laysan albatross, and they're known as bycatch. And we're destroying nature with industrial fishing, industrial forestry, and industrial farming.
So when you decide to paint something, what is it that makes you decide this is what I want to paint now? I mean, is it something to do with, like now, you're talking about this is part of the crisis in the environment. Is it something to do with the quality of the creature that you're painting? What is it that makes you start to paint?
Often it's driven by aesthetics. I see a particular, often it's the landscape or the chunk of habitat that I think is particularly yummy. However, things come out of the blue. For example, one painting in the show I think is a cardinal in sumac, and I got the idea for that being at the Smithsonian, where I had the biggest show of my career in 1987, and it was the year before, and they had an exhibition of Indian village crafts, and I was waiting outside the hall where the show was going on, and there was a big sort of rusty adobe wall, and a man wearing a red turban, a peasant from India who had been brought in to work on the crafts, walked by, and I went, wow, red on red. And I said, oh, great idea. I'll do a cardinal on some brilliant red background, just a red on. So that came strictly from the aesthetic.
Yeah, cardinals are amazingly incredible birds to paint, aren't they? But you've got a lot of what you paint is birds, and they're on the wing. I mean, they're constantly moving. How on earth do you capture them so beautifully?
Or, of course, I use photography. I can only think of one artist worth his salt who works directly from the bird, and he caught them in mist nets and put them in a little terrarium temporarily while he worked on them, and then he let them go again.
Well, I heard Audubon actually used to kill them.
Yeah, he shot them. That's right.
Audubon
shot them and hung them up on wires.
You don't do that.
Yeah, that's right. I don't like the cooked up look.
Yeah.
I can cook up stuff out of my head competently, but it's only merely competent. I love the particularity, and so I combine 5 to 50 photographs, and I orchestrate them the way, say, a watchmaker would build a watch or a clock, or I put the elements together to suit me.
So now, when you're painting, what are you striving for? I mean, I've read that you don't want to use that sentimental appeal that some wildlife paintings have. Is that something
that's when this again puts me in a period in history. When I was a kid, Bambi came out, and I was a huge Disney fan, Fantasia and Bambi and Pinocchio, etc. And my friends, my mother's friends were having babies in those days, and she kept inducing me to paint Little Thumpers and Bambis and Flower the Skunk for her friends' babies' rooms, and I was mass producing these darn things, and I got a case of Disney dysentery, I think. And I said, the sweetness and the syrupiness, it's what some of us. I consider myself an art snob. I know David here is too. It's schlock art, or the kind of art you find in the back of a pickup truck in a suburban mall or something like that. It's so easy to tug at the heartstrings and make it sentimental. I try to hold back from that.
So, David, you're a national expert on wildlife art. You've written a wonderful book about it, and you're the curator of this exhibit at the Natural History Museum right now. So what is it about Robert's work that made you really want to have an exhibit of his work here at the museum?
I think this is probably the 5th exhibition that I've been involved with of Bob's work as a one-man show, and I've exhibited his work since 1978 in group shows, and I've always admired Bob's work from early on for his courage in terms of attacking subjects that may not otherwise be found in wildlife art as a genre, and also his, I think, real self-consciousness of his place within the greater art world. of all art and of all wildlife art, there's just a very, very tiny percentage of the very top of artists who really make a difference, who really have an impact, who really will cause history to fold and unfold in new ways in the future. And Bob is one of these artists who's had that kind of impact. So I guess in the biggest sense, Allison, my interest in Bob Bateman's work is that he has caused art to pivot, to turn a corner, to take a new direction. And there's clear evidence of that in art history. There is a Bateman School of Art, for sure, of followers who emulate to be like Bob Bateman and who have studied with him and have admired his work and to follow him.
So what are some of the examples of the subjects that you're saying only Robert would tackle?
Well, early on, after he found his road to Damascus, as he says, and in the 1960s really became a superstar in the art world with an exhibition in London, for example, with exhibitions in Toronto, and then finding his place in the United States with exhibitions and long lines of patrons. He would tackle subjects such as vulture and wildebeest. It was a piece that I exhibited early on in an exhibition entitled Birds and Art, and it took my breath away and everyone else because it was raw nature. I mean, it was nature at its rawest sense. And you would otherwise in the exhibition see someone painting a mallard lighting on a pond or, just pretty birds. But this was something altogether different.
My mother didn't like it.
Can you describe it a little bit?
Well, it's zoomed in close as a white background. And it's the head of a wildebeest that was killed the evening before by some lions in Amboseli in Kenya. And so it's fresh raw meat. It's not decomposed, but most of the eyeballs missing and most of the skin is stripped off. And it kind of looks like a roast before you put it in the oven, except there's a bit of skin and hair there too.
And you spent hours painting this.
Yeah, and the horn. And then coming in is the vulture's neck and head. Which is not too gory, and the vultures have a very serious expression on their face, of course, at all times. And so it has an abstract quality with the hook of the horn and the hook of the vulture's neck and the hook of the beak, because I'm very interested in the abstract qualities as well. By the way,
the colors, too.
Yeah, David's last name is Wagner, by the way, which I don't think has been mentioned yet.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought we mentioned
okay.
you at the beginning, but yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
okay, great.
David Wagner is the curator.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. So this kind of a painting is the exact opposite in some ways of the sort of sentimental painting that a lot of wildlife painting is. David, would you give us some more examples of the kind of paintings that we'll see in this exhibit?
We'll bring that painting up to current time. Bob did a series in the 80s, a Carmana series, where he used imagery to attack the commercial harvesting of nature. Bob mentioned Drift Net, which is an iconic piece, but there are any number of other pieces. Ancient Machine, I think, or Big Machine and Ancient Forest is another, where it's a self-portrait of Bob confronting loggers in the Pacific Northwest, Sitka and other trees on Vancouver Island, and loggers harvesting the last 5%, if that, of ancient forests, old-growth forests that still remain. And he did another of a painting where I have it right here in the exhibition brochure entitled Carmana Contrast from 1989. I like it because it's an homage at once to color field painting and the abstract expressionist movement, say, of the 60s or 70s in its purest form, in pure design. In just pure design, it's an homage to art and a movement of art, of sort of a pop art or a style within abstract expressionism. But in particular, I would say 4/5 of the painting as a diptych is dedicated to the gray, sterile landscape where stumps and roots and the life have been removed from them. It's just dead.
A clear-cut
land. And the upper 1/5 of the canvas is green and lush with life and old-growth forest. And that is something that very few artists have done, and very few wildlife artists, if you want to talk about that genre in particular.
We're talking with Robert Bateman, who has an exhibit right now at the San Diego Natural History Museum. He's a renowned wildlife artist and author. Also, David Wagner, who is the curator of the exhibit and also a wildlife art author. So, David, tell us a little bit about the history of wildlife art. Where did it start? Back in the cave paintings, what would you say?
Sure. Back in the cave paintings would be a good place to start. I can't think of any earlier imagery, and artists then were we're painting wildlife and for all sorts of purposes and meanings. In more contemporary times, at least in North America, I think of a good starting point as the lost colony of Roanoke off of what is now North Carolina, and the work of John White, whose work is in the Queen's collection today of the British Museum, and was in a one-man show. The work comes from about 1580 to 1595 or so. It was at the Yale Center for British Art all summer long. And bringing that right up to present, going through Romanticism and the work of John James Audubon in the 19th century to Carl Rungius, the great Impressionist, whose work was much revered by the art establishment in the late 19th century. And many of these artists in the 19th century were members of the National Academy of Design and other elite artists groups. It's only in the later part of the 20th century that critics, for example, have found fault with much wildlife art and found it not worthy of sort of the pantheon of the highest achievements of art. But I think Robert Bateman's made a big difference and turned that around. And I can cite you a specific example, Allison. Mm-hmm. When we opened the show at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection in Toronto, or just outside of Toronto, a year ago, this is one of Canada's top art museums. I'd say one of the top 3 art museums in the entire nation, much akin to our Smithsonian because it focuses on the Group of 7 and other Canadian art, Indigenous art, Inuit art, etc. And Bob's show was so popular that the curatorial staff phoned me and asked, could we extend the hours into the evening hours? Could we extend weekend hours? And not only that, they extended the run of the show for as long as it could possibly go up and right until it buffered right up to the next venue, which was the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, another great institution. So wildlife art has come a long way. Bob's work was, I think, shaped much as an early artist by the art world around him, but today that has turned and he has shaped the art world around him through these exhibitions.
Well, it's very encouraging to find that there's so much popularity, bearing in mind, especially, Robert, what you're saying about how kids often don't go out into nature at all anymore, that maybe this is as close as they'll get, apart from the wild animal part, to some of these animals and what's happening out there in the natural world.
Exactly. Of course, I want to put in a word for television because I think it's a great agent for bad and particular video games and so on. But it is a small agent for good as well, because they're wonderful nature shows, and everybody's familiar with the fabulous nature shows that are on now, and it depends on what the kids choose to watch.
Now, I understand you started a program called Get to Know.
That's right. I was visiting Kelowna, British Columbia. It was a week for getting kids to wildlife, and I was asked the question, if you had one wish for children, what would it be? And I said that they would get to know the names of their neighbors of other species. I'm told that North American kids can recognize over 1,000 corporate logos, but don't know the names of 10 birds and trees that share the same land and the same air around them. And they're very keen on these corporate logos, but they're losing interest. And this is the first time since caveman that David was just mentioning, since Paleolithic times and earlier, that this link with nature has been broken. Probably you, and certainly people my age, played around out in nature, understood nature, but now it's all stuff on screens. And it's bad for the body, bad for the soul, and bad for the mind, for the brains as well. And we're getting obesity and attention deficit disorder and depression and suicide and all these things, which can be ameliorated. There's a fantastic book by a San Diego journalist, Richard Louv, and I hope you've had him on, or he's been on.
Yes,
he's probably been on more than once. My daughter's met him.
Talking about
I hope to meet him tomorrow. My daughter's actually has met him.
He says a lot of the same things you do about
Oh,
children being
Well, yes, that's right. I treat his book as the Bible. I'm including it in my. I'm giving a lecture tonight, by the way, at 6:30 at the museum, which I hope to plug a bit and hope people would like to come and see it. And I have his book cover in my lecture and talk about the things that he talks about too.
So when you're looking ahead at maybe something that you're aspiring to paint with all of these values that you've been talking about, are there any subjects that you've got in mind for future paintings?
Oh, I got a whole bunch of things that I want to do. When you have the world of nature to base it on, I couldn't possibly, in 2 or 3 lives, really begin to scratch the surface. Birgit and I, my wife, were at the Platte River last spring to see the great, this is in Nebraska, to see the great sandhill crane migration come in. And I have an idea for a diptych. There's a diptych in the show right now of storks at coming into a slough in the evening, and I use gold leaf so that the slough kind of gleams as it would in the evening, and it's all very dark. Well, I got a plan for another one, only this will be hundreds and hundreds of sandhill cranes at dawn on the Platte River. And the Platte River has big environmental issues of overuse of water. We know about that in California, I'm sure, and they know about it in Nebraska, etc. So, but I'm looking forward to the abstract quality of the gleaming river at dawn and all these dark shapes of the cranes. Looking forward to that.
Good. Well, I hope we've managed to convey some of the beauty of these paintings for people who might be interested in going. We've got a lecture tonight. Robert Bateman and David Wagner will present a lecture and book signing tonight at 6:30 at the Natural History Museum, and the Art of Robert Bateman exhibit will be ongoing through February the 1st. You can also go to kpbs.org these days for more information. So, Robert Bateman, I'd like to thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
And David Wagner, too.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.